1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
You need anything? You need anything? Oh, that's usually my duty. Hold on.
I wanted to thank you
Parker.
for your call yesterday
Where-
and the conversation I had.
Can you go up in my office and bring down the gavel? My one duty.
Where do we park in the back? I've been riding around for 30 minutes back there, and the only place I found it said restricted.
Well, that was where.
Yeah, but there was nobody back there to, and so I go in there and there's about 25 cars. I said, well, there's not 25 commissioners, so there's something that I
There's
can't
right
park
it was right along the front
Should they
road.
all be up here during
Well,
the meeting or not?
No, just the
No,
committee.
just the committee. I'm wrong.
No, I don't. I've never asked for that.
We will be starting with a committee meeting, so only the committee members will be on the stage at the beginning. And we're waiting on the gavel to come down. You have a copy of the new resolution. Let me check to make sure Sarah's here. Have the laptop ready to make it. Yeah, if you will. You'll sit over here with staff and make changes on that with Karen if any are required.
We both have to leave at 12:45, no matter what.
Yeah, 12:45.
So Sarah is. No, in case there are edits here, she's going to make them in real time. Yeah, we're about to start. I know. Here it comes. Now we're ready. All right, we're ready.
Good morning to all in attendance, in person or remotely through the media, to this meeting of the Study Committee on the Confederate Monuments on North Carolina's Union Square, or otherwise known as the Capitol grounds. Would the members of the Study Committee identify themselves as being present?
Chris Fonville.
Sam Dixon.
Valerie Ann Johnson.
Noah Reynolds.
David Ruffin. Our sole purpose for this meeting is to make and approve our recommendations to the full North Carolina Historical Commission on our work since September 22nd last, when charged by the full commission to study the Office of Administration's request to relocate 3 monuments on the grounds of Union Square, again otherwise known as the Capitol grounds. Those monuments are the Capitol Confederate Monument, the Henry Lawson Wyatt Memorial or Monument, and the North Carolina Women of the Confederacy Monument. Upon approval of our recommendations, we will adjourn immediately and convene a meeting of the full North Carolina Historical Commission. There are a couple of housekeeping points that would be pertinent to this meeting of the committee as well as the full meeting of the commission, and that is as a due courtesy to those in attendance to please turn off all cellular devices that would have ringtones to them. Obviously, proper decorum would be in order. As we would anticipate, this is not a public hearing, but it's certainly an open meeting for deliberation of this committee and the commission as a whole. I would certainly welcome any members of the Council of State, the Judiciary, or members of the General Assembly who may be present at this point. There's also a understandable requirement at the beginning of any meeting of this nature, and that is to make it abundantly clear that there are no conflicts of interest relative to what items are on the agenda or whatever decisions we make as a body going forward. So I ask the members of this committee to specifically state of no knowledge of any conflict of interest relative to the charge of our business today in this committee, and then we'll re-ask that of the full commission.
No.
I have no conflict of interest.
No conflict.
No conflict.
None from my point of view. Okay, as chair, I would like to thank the over 7,000 citizens who have given us feedback on this very significant issue. We also appreciate the responses of the various academic and professional resources from which we solicited opinions. Many thanks certainly go to the staff of the North Carolina Department of Natural and Cultural Resources, in particular Dr. Kevin Cherry, and I do this all the time. He's got a list of his title that sounds like an English entitlement here, but it's Deputy Secretary of the North Carolina Department of Natural and Cultural Resources, Secretary of the North Carolina Historical Commission, and State Historic Preservation Officer and Keeper of the Capitol Building. And the reason I say this every time is you're so critical to each one, and we appreciate your service for that. Certainly, Phil Fagan, who is General Counsel to the Department of Natural and Cultural Resources, and Karen Blum, who is Special Deputy Attorney General and has provided counsel to the North Carolina Historical Commission. But from a personal perspective, I have to say that my greatest sense of gratitude, frankly, is directed to these 4 co-commissioners who have, with me, comprised this working study committee. We come from very diverse political persuasions and backgrounds, and this may appear a little shocking and really non-credible in this era. We get along extremely well, and we have deliberated with virtually no or really no acrimony whatsoever. We've taken our positions, we've made our positions clear, and we still have some differences of opinion, but there's been absolutely nothing but a sense of mutual respect and a sense that we are trying to find a rational solution to this very difficult issue, and like issues of this nature. In fact, I've kind of figured out what our next gig should be. We ought to tour the state and do a seminar on how to get along and how to actually govern the state. Does that sound like a good plan? So we do appreciate very much. Now, the 2 things that we're going to do in this committee is we are going to give some personal statements. We hope be 5 or so minutes in duration, and then we will open the floor for some suggested motions on some resolutions that would, upon approval, would be then deliberated at the full commission meeting. So at this point, I would like to ask Dr. Frommel if you would begin that process.
Thank you, Chairman Ruffin. Thank you for doing such a great job and leading us in this process. You've worked long and hard, and we really appreciate your efforts. In his 1951 novel, Requiem for a Nun, William Faulkner wrote, "The past is never dead. It's not even past. Our shared history has shaped and continues to shape us as individuals and as residents of our communities and states and as Americans. As a professional historian for 40 years now, my charge has been to seek to understand, interpret, and explain historical events, themes, and history makers. The past is often good, but sometimes bad and ugly. We cannot alter or change history or right past wrongs and injustices by attempting to erase it or topple or relocate its symbols. We should study history to remind us, teach us, guide us, and inspire us to be better persons and better citizens. We must not, however, use it to wage cultural warfare against one another. We are all Americans in this journey. We travel together while enjoying America's blessings and preserving them for our posterity. We may have arrived in America on different ships, but we are all in the same boat now. As to the Confederate monuments on the old state capitol grounds in historic downtown Raleigh, I trust that white North Carolinians can appreciate what they represent, especially to our fellow African American citizens. Make no mistake, the Confederacy was established in large part to protect and defend the institution of slavery and keep Black Americans, totaling almost 4 million in 1860, enslaved in perpetuity. Whereas the U.S. Constitution did not cite the word slavery, but instead employed the phrase persons held to service or labor, the Confederate Constitution, adopted on March 11, 1861, and effective from February 22, 1862 until the end of the war 3 years later, addressed the legality of slavery directly and by name in 2 articles and 4 sections, including Article 1, Section 9(4), no law denying or impairing the right of property in Negro slaves shall be passed. Article 4, Section 2(1), the citizens of each state shall be entitled to all privileges and immunities of citizens in the several states, and shall have the right of transit and travel in any state of this Confederacy with their slaves and other property. And the right of property in said slaves shall not be thereby impaired. Speaking in Savannah, Georgia, only 10 days after the adoption of the Confederate government's Constitution, Confederate Vice President Alexander Stephens claimed that, quote, "Our new government is founded upon the idea, its foundations are laid, its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery, subordination to the superior race, is his natural and normal condition." Confederate President Jefferson Davis observed that, quote, "African slavery as it exists is a moral, a social, and a political blessing." Only after the war ended in Confederate defeat did Stephens, Davis, and other proponents of slavery attempt to rewrite the causes of the war as constitutional issues. All that said, by my calculations, based on the comments posted on the public portal on the Department of Natural and Cultural Resources website and comments made to the Confederate Monument Study Committee during its public forum in March 2018, more than 80% of North Carolinians are not in favor of relocating the 3 Confederate monuments: the obelisk to the Confederate dead of North Carolina, The statue to Private Henry Lawson Wyatt, a 19-year-old non-slaving holding farmer who was the first Tar Heel killed in action during the war, and the memorial to the North Carolina women of the Confederacy, from the old state capitol grounds to the Bentonville State Historic Site in Johnston County, North Carolina. Clearly, the statues and memorials hold different meanings to different people, despite the fact that no one living today condones slavery, while readily conceding the evil, cruel, and inhumane bondage system that denied African Americans their freedom and agency. For some, they may represent the sacrifice of ancestors who were killed or died in the war. For others, the Southern soldiers' sense of duty to family and state, however misguided the cause for which they fought, at least indirectly, that is, to maintain slavery. To this day, the United States government recognizes Confederate soldiers as American fighting men and provides at taxpayers' expense intricately carved gravestones to mark their final resting place in both private and public burial grounds, including Arlington National Cemetery in Virginia. For others still, the statues have become a part of the historical and cultural landscape that should be preserved as a reminder of man's inhumanity to man and to serve as a message that we must never pass this way again. As to the destruction of the two statues of remembrance, one in Durham in 2017 and the other in Chapel Hill this past Monday night, I personally am dismayed by the wanton vandalism and destruction by protesters for political purposes and the seeming inability of those in authority to protect the public property as set forth by North Carolina's 2015 General Assembly Statute 100-2.1, Protection of Monuments, Memorials, and Works of Art. As Abraham Lincoln wrote so eloquently in 1838, let every American, every lover of liberty, every well-wisher to posterity, never violate the laws of the country and never to tolerate their violation by others. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. astutely observed that, quote, violence as a way of achieving racial justice is both impractical and immoral. I am not unmindful of the fact that violence often brings about momentary results, he said, but in spite of temporary victories, violence never brings permanent peace. And finally, speaking in 1862, Abraham Lincoln reminded his fellow Americans that, quote, we cannot escape history. We will be remembered in spite of ourselves. No personal significance or insignificance can spare one or another of us. The fiery trial through which we pass will light us down in honor or dishonor to the latest generation. We hold the power and bear the responsibility. We shall nobly save or meanly lose the best last hope on earth. The way is plain, peaceful, and generous, just, a way which, if followed, the world will forever applaud and God must forever bless.
Thank you, sir.
I'm a capital trial lawyer, and I represent people that are facing the death penalty. I'm also a lawyer that works extensively in the historic preservation field. And so as part of my training, and as a sworn duty that I have given to the court and on several other boards and commissions, my duty is to look at a law, and we sit as a judge and a jury today, and to follow that law. We have a 2015 law that basically says we can't move monuments. And the beautiful thing about living in North Carolina and in this country is that if we don't like laws, then we can lobby the General Assembly to change those laws. And so there's an avenue that this law could be changed if that's the will of the people. And that's where we're lucky to live in a place that you can actually change laws. I know that some people change laws to strengthen them, and some people change laws to weaken them or to make them more amenable to what they are, their point of view. I worked hard to lobby the legislature for the historic tax credit law that was passed a couple of years ago to save that. So, and it worked. So, effort can go into the law to change it. What we can do today is clear. We can recommend that the monuments be, have some context around them. We can recommend that what is put around these monuments tells the truth, that slavery was the cause of the Civil War. It'll tell the truth and the full breadth of the African-American story in North Carolina, that it'll give a person who goes to those monuments a sense of real history and a sense of the struggle that an enormous part of our state went through. So I believe the monuments need to tell the truth, and based upon the law that we have today, I do not think we can move them, but I think we can make a better, tell a better story and tell a full and inclusive story.
Okay. I wanted to thank the study committee members for working on this with us for the past, I believe, 10 months. And I want to thank Dr. Cherry and his staff as well for their work in supporting us as we explored and researched this difficult and challenging topic. So I want to thank the staff of the Department of Cultural Resources. Thank you. My personal statement may take a little bit longer, but I spent a great deal of time thinking about what I wanted to say. So I hope that you will listen carefully. My journey on the Monument Study Committee. Union Square holds a prominent place on North Carolina's Capitol grounds. Visitors to the site have often compared its collection of monuments to game pieces on a chessboard. After the public hearings held by the State Historical Commission's Monument Study Committee in March, I walked around Union Square and noticed 4 1/2 of these 14 monuments were either dedicated to the Civil War, contain the word Confederate, or have a Confederate flag depicted within their bronze plaque. I believe 4 1/2 monuments dedicated in part or in whole to the Civil War or the Confederacy is an overrepresentation of this theme. Since 1990, no new memorials have been added to Union Square, and North Carolina General Statute 100-2.1 has significantly restricted the ability to remove and relocate any monuments. Union Square has become a chessboard frozen in time, with 14 monuments that can neither be moved, removed, or added to. Union Square is at the heart of the government of our state, and the objects in that square support the promises of our government. We need to consider carefully what the promises of our government are and how we support those promises with the objects of remembrance we place in our state's most prominent public square. When North Carolinians who are also Native Americans or African Americans or women pass by Union Square and see the 14 monuments there, do these objects make them feel as though they are a part of their state? Do they believe that their hopes and their dreams and their dignity are supported by the public art located on our Capitol grounds? What rights and promises do these 14 objects convey to visitors to our state? The statue of George Washington was the first monument placed there in 1857, and the memorial to the Confederate dead was the second in 1895. These first monuments mark periods of upheaval in the history of our state and our nation. A critique of the monuments on Union Square. John Coffey, curator of American and Modern Art at the North Carolina Museum of Art, wrote a critique of the monuments on Union Square on February the 15th, 2010. He said, quote, "As one who is a native of Raleigh and reasonably well versed in the history of this state, I am also fascinated by these sculptures as expressions of ideas and sentiments, now sometimes hard to appreciate or even comprehend. If one believes that the commemorative monuments on Union Square should honor the most important events and the most praiseworthy men and women of North Carolina, then they present a disparate group of monuments fails in many ways." Collectively, they convey to the visitor an abiding reverence for the Confederacy, for war and warriors, and for politicians and civic leaders of decidedly mixed legacies. The lack of diversity among the monuments. At the swearing-in of the African American Heritage Commission on February 27, 2009, State Supreme Court Justice Patricia Goodson Timmons noted the lack of diversity among the Capitol memorials. In particular, the African American Heritage Commission stated, quote, "We wish to bring to the attention of the North Carolina Historical Commission the vital and central role played by African Americans in North Carolina's long history, from the appearance of the first imported bondsman in the 17th century to the civil rights movement of the 20th century and ongoing struggle for equal rights." In April 2016, Governor Pat McCrory publicly announced and encouraged North Carolina citizens to participate in 8 public hearings across the state to offer feedback on new monuments on the state capitol grounds to commemorate the achievements of African Americans. Governor McCrory said, quote, "These hearings will allow more people to play an active role in helping the state recognize the contributions of African Americans have made to North Carolina." 2.5 years have now passed since the African American Memorials Committee held these public hearings. No further steps have been taken, and no public funding has been provided. Our state now seems paralyzed by a preoccupation with defending an incomplete representation of our past within our most public square, instead of reaching forward into a new future and exploring new possibilities for how we represent our state with our public art. My personal story. I agree with the African American Heritage Commission's statement. African Americans have played a vital role in my life, in the lives of my ancestors, and in the lives and history of the people of North Carolina. This is my personal story. My great-great-grandparents, Hardin William Reynolds, and his wife, Nancy Jane Cox Reynolds, owned 88 enslaved African Americans in 1863, who planted and picked tobacco on their Rock Springs plantation in Patrick County, Virginia. My great-grandfather's brother, A.D. Reynolds, served as a major in the Confederate Army representing Virginia during the Civil War. Beginning in 1875, my great-grandparents, R.J. Reynolds and his wife, Catherine Smith Reynolds, employed thousands of African-American factory workers in my hometown of Winston-Salem to twist lumps and roll cigarettes, and later to work in their home and gardens at Renolda Village, built in 1917. Beginning in 1933, my grandparents, Dick and Blitz Reynolds, employed dozens of African Americans during the Great Depression to help construct and operate their Long Creek Dairy Farm in Surrey County, and to work as cooks and gardeners and maids in their home at Mary Acres, built in 1941. When I was a child in the 1970s, my parents also employed housekeepers in the home, and I was introduced to African American culture in a manner similar to that of the character Skeeter in Catherine Stockett's 2000 novel, The Help. Like Skeeter, as a young adult, I began to explore and to question my history and my heritage. As a high school junior, I researched and wrote on Supreme Court Justice John M. Harlan's sole dissenting opinion in the 1896 Plessy versus Ferguson case, and learned how the legalization of separate but equal status for African Americans had launched the era of Jim Crow in the South. More recently, in 2001, I began to attend a local African American church in Winston-Salem, where I was baptized in 2005 by the same African American pastor, Lewis Devlin, who later buried my father in 2009 in our ancestral cemetery in Patrick County, Virginia. And most recently, on October the 3rd, 2015, I married my wife, Deborah, before God, officiated by a different African American minister, my longtime friend, the Reverend Paul A. Lowe, Jr. My story and the history of my family and the history of many African American families in Patrick and Henry counties in Virginia and Surrey, Stokes, and Forsyth counties in North Carolina have been intimately intertwined ever since we first all arrived in America under markedly different circumstances hundreds and hundreds of years ago. A time to move forward. Casey Wallers, a recent law school graduate from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, specifically wrote about North Carolina General Statute 100-2.1, also known as the, quote, Heritage Protection Act, for the North Carolina Law Review on September the 1st, 2016. This is her central theme, quote, "The North Carolina Heritage Protection Act creates a lack of accountability on behalf of the state legislature, usurps the powers of local governments, and engenders confusion as to its proper scope. Consequently, the North Carolina General Assembly should modify the Heritage Protection Act by removing the illusory delegation to the North Carolina Historical Commission, clarifying that the act clearly applies to only state-owned property rather than both state and municipally owned property, and allowing for the erection of plaques that contextualize these monuments within local history so that the messages the monuments are intended to convey are clear. I was reminded many times during the public comment period that I am not an elected official, and I believe that it would be preferable for Governor Roy Cooper's request to remove the 3 Confederate monuments from Union Square and to replace them on the Bentonville battlefield should be resolved by the will of the people of North Carolina, acting through their representatives in the General Assembly, rather than through requests to this small group of appointed commissioners or through actions taken in our state courts. However, the persistent inaction, inflexibility, and insensitivity of our General Assembly to the true social history of all of the people of our state has caused me to act. The people of our state deserve an answer, and the inability to decide or even to act on the issue of Confederate monuments at the July 28th meeting of the UNC Board of Governors may have unfortunately and inadvertently contributed to the unlawful destruction of property that we witnessed this week when protesters pulled down the statue of Silent Sam in Chapel Hill. I am reminded of the words of the late Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr., who wrote in his April 16, 1963, letter from a Birmingham jail. How can you advocate breaking some laws and obeying others? The answer lies in the fact that there are 2 types of laws, just and unjust. I would be the first to advocate obeying just laws. One has not only a legal but a moral responsibility to obey just laws. Conversely, one has a moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws. I would agree with St. Augustine that an unjust law is no law at all. I was appointed to this commission as a historian, and I am neither a lawyer nor a judge. My loyalty as a historian rests within the oath that I swore as a newly appointed historical commissioner to protect and defend the constitutions of North Carolina and the United States, and to protect and defend the truth and integrity of our state's history. The protection of history and the promotion of justice neither includes the unlawful destruction of public property, nor the circumvention of the oversight of duly elected and appointed government officials. However, history can be preserved by removing and replacing historical objects from one site to another, or by erecting historical markers beside them as time progresses to state the original context and themes that surround their original placement. I believe the 28-year moratorium on new monuments should be lifted, public and private funding provided, and new and diverse monuments added to Union Square, such as the proposed African American Memorial supported by Governor Pat McCrory in 2016. I believe the 3 Confederate monuments listed in the petition by Governor Roy Cooper should be removed and replaced at the Bentonville battlefield and interpreted there. And regardless of whether they're ultimately removed or remain, all of the Confederate and other monuments on Union Square should have plaques erected beside them that provide context within our state's history so that the historical dedication messages that these monuments were intended to convey are clearly stated. Thank you.
First, I'd like to join my study committee members in thanking Dr. Cherry and his staff for being the support that we needed to get our work done. And for my committee members, all of us really worked well together. The remarks that I'm going to make will help you understand the position that I will be taking when we come to a vote. And I'll start with for the record. I come before you today to hold space, to speak for those who are silent and are silenced. The words of Raleigh-born Dr. Anna Julia Hayward Cooper, African-American feminist scholar and educator, found on pages 26 and 27 of the current United States passport, frame my response to the issue outlined below. The cause of freedom is not the cause of a race or a sect, a party or a class. It is the cause of humankind, the very birthright of humanity. The issue of Confederate monuments on the North Carolina state capitol grounds is actually a question of identity. With the request by Governor Roy Cooper to remove the Confederate monuments from the state capitol grounds, we have an opportunity to reshape and reframe how we understand ourselves as North Carolinians. This is not erasure, but an act of revelation, an act of using the absence of these monuments to create a more accurate statement regarding North Carolina and her constituents. It is reimagining citizenship in a more truthful and inclusive way. At the center of the Civil War was the continued enslavement of African people. As such, the monuments represent the commitment of North Carolina to uphold the Confederacy. These monuments are a continual visual presence of the ideology of white supremacy. They are really memorials, more appropriate to a cemetery space or in a museum if the museum contextualizes them appropriately. I write this as a Black woman, mother, anthropologist, queer, worker, North Carolina resident, and descendant of the Gullah Geechee people. None of these identities are reflected by the current monuments on the state capitol grounds. Removal is not erasure. It is creating a space that reflects all North Carolinians and their contributions to our state. These memorials to white supremacy should not continue to be on our public grounds. For those who believe that removing the memorials demonstrates partisan capitulation to an imagined fringe group is to deny the full inclusion in our state of the people who were instrumental in making the state what it is today. We need on the state capitol grounds work that, quote, ensures all voices are heard and all cultures are valued and integrated. Remarks from Vivette Jeffries Logan, who is a member of the Okanichi Band. Of the Saponi Nation, the indigenous people of North Carolina's Orange, Alamance, and Caswell counties. What is currently reflected by the statues and plaques placed on Union Square were designed to promote racism, white supremacy, and anti-Semitism. There's nothing honorable about them. According to UNC Charlotte historian Dr. Karen Cox, today's defenders of Confederate monuments are either unaware of the historical context or do not care. Like generations of whites before them, they are more invested in the mythology that has attached itself to these sentinels of white supremacy because it serves their cause. They were erected, end quote. They were erected during a time when active legal and illegal acts of terrorism were perpetrated against persons who were considered non-whites, indigenous North Carolinians, Jews, Blacks, Browns, and others. At present, the state capitol grounds reflect an immorality that is not acceptable. It reflects an adherence to ideas, practices, and a way of life that is oppressive, unjust, and rooted in racism, misogyny, fascism, and hatred. Moving the statues does not hide history. Instead, it will allow us to amplify all the voices in North Carolina. We cannot afford the divisive, exclusionary, racist practices of a few to be what defines North Carolina. That will be our legacy if these statues and plaques uplifting the Confederacy remain in place. Whether or not the North Carolina Historical Commission has the authority by legislative enactment to support Governor Roy Cooper's request to authorize the removal of the Confederate monuments is irrelevant at this time. As Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. reminds us in Why We Can't Wait, quote, American history is replete with compromise. American history chronicles the Missouri Compromise, which permitted the spread of slavery to new states, the Hayes-Tilden Compromise, which withdrew the federal troops from the South and signaled the end of Reconstruction, the Supreme Court's compromise in Plessy v. Ferguson, which enunciated the infamous separate but equal philosophy. These measures compromise not only the liberty of the Negro, but the integrity of America, end quote. Let's not further erode our integrity by allowing these memorials, tributes to dishonor and white supremacy, to remain on our state capitol grounds. The fix is not complicated. We have a responsibility to include the heritage, history, and culture of all the people who call North Carolina home. It is in the diversity of its people that North Carolina realizes its richness. We need to restart the initiative begun in 2010 to erect on the state capitol grounds monuments that reflect the considerable contributions of African Americans and Native Americans to the state of North Carolina. Let this be our legacy, one of inclusion, truth, and courage. Respectfully submitted by Dr. Valerie A. Johnson, Chair, North Carolina African American Heritage Commission, member of the North Carolina Historical Commission, and member of the Study Committee on Confederate Monuments.
Thank you, Dr. Johnson. Today, not unlike so many other times in our history, we really are dealing, I think, with the vestiges of arguably the original sin of the American experience, and that is the institution of slavery. The question is not to deny this, but how do we continue our journey for reconciliation and perspective? Not to fall captive to the extreme rhetoric, polemics, or even actions of today's polarized politics, but to accept that history teaches us that there are no absolutes, and thus to deny or be ignorant of history is to succumb to a fate of repeating its sins. Throughout this committee's process, I've been dealing, frankly, with multiple and I consider rather pernicious consequences of denial. Denial of the role of slavery in the Civil War, as Dr. Fonville so eloquently stated. Denial of the Jim Crow heritage of many of the Confederate statutes. Denial of the truth that not all North Carolinians, then or now, subscribe to the cause of the Confederacy. Denial of our state government's role in not resolving this issue by now more constructively. Denial that mob rule engenders counterforces to one-up their reactions and incite even more levels of violence. And yes, denial of the need to understand that this era was part of our history, and thus its interpretation and allegiances in and of themselves are rights of a free people. Denying the constant dialogue and interpretation of history is counter to my public and personal values. These are largely and were largely forged during my coming of age during the turbulent 1960s. I'd like to share three perspectives with you. Irrespective of my career in business and banking, I'm a college history major, and every tenet of its academic disciplines directs us to the objective acceptance and study of the good, the bad, and the ugly of our collective experiences. I'm a descendant of Edmund Ruffin, the noted agronomist turned secessionist fanatic sent to Charleston Harbor to ceremoniously fire the first shot of the Civil War. As a youth, I scoffed at reverential family tributes to this man, because even in that early age in my life, I realized that civil rights needed to replace civil war in our Southern heritage. In what would otherwise be, other than this, through this commission's work, a mere footnote in my life, I have been constantly reminded of an experience I had in the summer of 1967 while in Europe, between high school and college. I met a German student my age. Knowing that I was from the South, he unrelentingly chastised me over race relations in our region and in the U.S. as a whole. I tried to explain, yes, they were not acceptable at this point. I did cite progress being made with the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, but he was not impressed. He continued his attack. And in frustration, I finally had to say this to him in words to the effect, given your country's fairly recent history, how do you have the moral high ground on race relations? And what he said back to me was very startling, and I think rather apt in today's dialogue, and that was, I know we lost the war, I know very little to nothing about Adolf Hitler. His memory, his even ability to discuss him has been expunged from our body politic. The lesson there, I think, is clear. We don't deny history. We don't deny the ability to constantly reinterpret it, recontextualize it, and most importantly, learn from it. The passion and intensity accompanying this issue, and yes, much of the media's focus is likely to be on kind of a binary up or down vote of this committee and this commission about the status of the monuments. But frankly, I think today's diverse North Carolina citizenry deserves a more studied and even-tempered response, not a placation of either polarized extreme. My sense is that the great broad breadth of North Carolinians, native and transplant, black and white, are yearning for a rational solution to this issue and like recommendations of this committee. And yes, one that speaks to the broad middle of our body politic, so lately starved of any attention. I believe that this diverse committee, as I think you've all begun to realize is rather diverse, can offer such balanced recommendations. Should the full commission agree that the three monuments may stay up at this point in time, it must be said that we, as a committee, I think, are united in our determination to revisit this issue should no progress be made on rectifying the current undefendable imbalance of the Confederate memorializations on Union Square. This should include demonstrative action, to me, most importantly, to tributes to and sacrifices of North Carolina African Americans, and for that matter, Native Americans, and for the struggles and progress of civil rights in our state. But all of this must be accompanied and accomplished within the bounds of law. I know people on both sides of this issue may be disappointed, short of an absolute victory for their side, such is the politics we live in today. But as I said on September 22nd, like Noah, sworn in as a new member of this commission, that I believe we had to move away from a if I win, you lose dynamic and to a more constructive, respectful, and civil discourse. Thus, in that spirit, I am hopeful that our recommendations today will add to and not detract from all of our people's continuing interpretation of this difficult chapter in our American experience. I appreciate your ability to listen to our personal statements in these regards, because I think it does at least reflect the weeks and months of our deliberations, and that we, as I said earlier, have different specific personal points of view, but have throughout the process tried very hard to reach some rational recommendations. So at this point, I will entertain some motions for consideration of resolutions.
Motions proposed by the Confederate Monument Study Committee for adoption by the North Carolina Historical Commission. 1, resolved that the North Carolina Historical Commission considers the existence of the 3 Confederate monuments located on the state capitol grounds in Raleigh, the monument to the Confederate dead of North Carolina, to Henry Lawson Wyatt, and to the North Carolina women of the Confederacy, as an over-representation and over-memorialization of a difficult era in North Carolina history. That in order to present a fair and more accurate explanation of the Civil War and its aftermath in North Carolina, additional signage with historical facts and context should be added adjacent to the 3 monuments to ensure that the significant contributions of African Americans are presented, along with an explanation of the struggles they endured in North Carolina as they fought for civil rights and social justice. 2.
Dr. Farnwell, I think by agreement we had that we would vote on each resolution separately.
All right.
Okay. So I hear a motion from you. Is there a second to consider Resolution 1?
I'll second it.
Is there any discussion?
I'd like to hear all three monuments, three resolutions read before we vote, because I haven't
Okay.
fully had a chance to look at them, so they seem to be interrelated in some context.
Okay, all right.
We
With that-
just have a reading of
With
them.
with that in mind, I think that's a fair suggestion, Commissioner Reynolds. So, Dr. Farmer, will you proceed on with reading Resolutions 2 and 3?
Yes. Motion 2, resolved that given the specific legislative prohibition against the removal of objects of remembrance, the Commission at this time is unable to recommend the removal or relocation of the 3 Confederate monuments because removal or relocation is not required to preserve these 3 monuments. Even if relocation were necessary to preserve these 3 Confederate monuments, the specific requirement to relocate objects of remembrance to locations of similar prominence or honor imposed by North Carolina General Statute Section 100-2.1 would be very difficult. With a preference for encouraging the continued interpretation of history, including the African American experience, rather than the denial of history, the Commission would still not be able to recommend the removal or relocation of these 3 Confederate monuments on the state capitol grounds. 3, resolved that in accord with General Statutes Section 100-2.1 and 143B-62, the Commission recommends, first, that the 3 Confederate monuments on the state capitol grounds be interpreted with signage appropriately composed and erected adjacent to the monuments to provide a balanced context and accounting of the monuments' erection in their time and political history, and of the struggle to overcome the consequences of the slavery that caused the Civil War and the subsequent oppression, subjugation of African American people. And second, that the Department of Natural and Cultural Resources plan, design, and raise funds for the construction of 1 or more additional monuments on Capitol Square to memorialize the accomplishments and contributions of North Carolina's African Americans. And third, that the Governor and the General Assembly work together to ensure that 1 or more additional monuments on the state capitol grounds is constructed without delay.
Okay, there's been a first, obviously the motion for the first has been made and a second, so let's proceed to any discussion on Resolution 1?
Is not the second part of Resolution 1 exactly what Resolution 3 is stating?
There is, I think, potentially some overlap in that, but I think we felt that was important to put the context of that in Resolution 1 as well. Okay. I think there's a strong sense, if I may say, take the liberty to say this, I think there's an absolute strong sense. One of the things that was in no way debated in this committee was the disproportionate memorialization of the Confederacy is not defendable. It's just not defendable. And that, I think, represents the spirit of this committee without any hesitation to say that.
Absolutely.
But in Resolution 1, is it not embedded within the resolution that it's implicit that you're voting to have them stay? Is that wherever they end up or if they stay on Union Square? I'm just confused with 1 and 3. They tend to blend together and it makes it difficult to be discrete. I just need some clarity on that.
There is an overlap. It begins with that.
Yeah, would you propose an amendment to that then?
I think that it's redundant. I think that it's important. I would feel that it's important to be able to vote that there's an overrepresentation of that theme on the square without having to delve into what you're already stating in 2 and 3 in conjunction with that statement. I do think it's redundant. If you struck it from that in order all the way down, it would give the committee an opportunity to state whether or not they felt there was an overrepresentation of those monuments, and I don't think it would detract from what you've resolved in 3 either. Or you could strike it and add it to the end of 3 if there was a particular language that you felt was lost in 3 that wasn't spoken to in the second part of 1.
So if you remove the sentence that begins that in order to present, right?
Yes.
If that's stricken, where would you have that sense of imbalance?
Put in 3, just add it to 3.
Or you're just saying move it to 3?
Yes, you can just, in whole, just pick it up and move it to 3, because I think that 3 addresses that as well. You've already mentioned in 3 that you wish to erect signage adjacent to the monuments, et cetera, to provide a balanced context, et cetera.
Okay. Would you put that in a motion?
Yes, I would move that on Resolution 1, that the resolution stop at North Carolina history, and everything after that, beginning with that in order to present, be cut in whole and pasted and moved into number 3.
Would you be, Commissioner Reynolds, would you be satisfied that that be the first sentence in Resolution 3?
Yes, that would be fine.
Okay, because I think that's, in my opinion, that's very important to represent our
Right.
strong belief of the imbalance that needs to be.
I think that has to be in the form of an amendment to the current resolution that's voted on, and then the resolution's voted on.
So you have to accept the amendment then.
Okay, so as we hear there's an amendment to the recommendation or the move to approve Resolution 1. Let's accept or vote on the amendment offered by Commissioner Reynolds. Those in favor of taking that sentence that begins that in order. I need a second. I'm sorry. Second, sorry. And Mr. Dixon has seconded that, and so we will move that sentence to be the first sentence in Resolution 3. All in favor of that suggested amendment, vote aye.
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 All opposed? Okay.
Mr. Chairman, hold on 1 second. Our state archivist is making changes to the resolution as they are voted upon, so.
Okay. All right. So having removed the last sentence and replaced and relocated it to a subsequent resolution, Dr. Frombo, will you restate your motion as amended? Is that your position?
Yes, I
Approve
make the
resolution?
motion that the committee vote in favor of the resolutions as amended.
Okay. And there's a second to that. Okay. All in favor of Resolution 1 as amended, say aye.
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 All opposed? Okay. Resolution 1 as amended is approved unanimously. Okay, Resolution 2. Is there any discussion on it? Again, this is the resolution that was basically acknowledging, from our perspective, the limitations of the legal or statutory limitations of our ability, whether or not we preferred to remove the statutes or not, our ability to do so. We believed, I think collectively, we were constrained significantly from doing that. And this is effectively an acknowledgement of that. Any other discussion on that point?
Yeah, as it's worded, I would have to neither vote yes or no and abstain from that. It appears like I'm interpreting the law there. I believe we have an opinion from Karen Bloom in the Department of Justice, which does state that the commission does have the authority to remove and recontextualize the monuments. So I would be hesitant on the record to vote either way on number 2 based on that. So I would have to abstain on that vote as it's written for that reason. I would like to hear from Karen Blum, if she's in the audience, about what our legal abilities are as a commission, and is that consistent with what number 2 says?
There's no microphone over here. I don't know if that's hot. Podium. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, normally the commission does have the right to go into a closed session to receive legal advice to preserve the attorney-client privilege. Alternatively, the commission could also waive its right to attorney-client privilege and receive legal advice in open session. What would be the commission's pleasure? Or the committee's pleasure,
I move we waive.
Yeah, I certainly would prefer an open discussion of that. So we need to vote on whether or not we go into open or closed session relative to seeking legal advice. I believe Commissioner Dixon has motion to waive the closed session, right? Is that a fair way to describe that? So all in favor of waiving the need to go into, I need a second.
I second that. Transparency, very important.
Any discussion on that? All in favor of voting to waive going into closed session for attorney-client discussion, so move or so state your position. All in favor, aye?
Aye.
Aye.
All opposed, no. Okay?
Okay, just to reiterate, you waived your right to preserve attorney-client privilege, so I will continue with presenting legal advice in open session. Mr. Reynolds, you asked about removal, whether or not the monuments can be reinterpreted. Section 100-2.1 prevents or restricts the removal or relocation in certain circumstances. It does not address alteration. So as long as the monuments are reinterpreted or altered in a manner that does not substantively change the nature of the monument, it could be, in my opinion, altered. Now that's not the opinion of the Attorney General's office. Disclaimer, it is my opinion as attorney to the committee and the commission. I don't know if that answers your question.
And it's that particular question, but as 2 is written, it seems to state that under all circumstances, the commission does not have the right to remove the statues and relocate them under any circumstances at all. I'm concerned that I'm playing lawyer by voting on number 2 as it's resolved, because it specifically states that our ability to move or not remove the statues is based on an implicit interpretation of the legal statute. And again, as I stated in my statement, I'm not a lawyer. So that's why I would feel I'd have to abstain from voting on that for that particular reason. If that makes any sense.
There are, Commissioner Reynolds, I think there is, again, I want to just speak from my perspective, not necessarily collectively everyone's, but I think there was a lot of thought that we were not, as you so aptly stated, not playing lawyer in this, but reflecting the kind of the sense of just from a non-legal standpoint of the constraints we were dealing with. And I think that was frankly, the spirit behind the written language in 2, not to necessarily try to, in fact, we've had some talk about trying to overload that resolution with a lot of specificity, and the consequence of that, in my opinion, and I'm not a lawyer, is that you put things out there that even people can then attack further. So admittedly, there is some, if you will, some generalization in Resolution 2, if that's a fair way to characterize that, but I think that at some level was done intentionally.
Mr. Chairman, if I might add, you have a petition before you that was brought under General Statute Section 100-2.1. I think it's incumbent on the commission to make a ruling one way or the other under the statute, and to some extent you must address the petition before you, and that requires you to also address Section 100-2.1.
Okay, thank you.
I just might add, I think the law is clear that the 2 prongs that we would have to find would be that removal or relocation was required to preserve the object, and two, it would be necessary, one, if it had to preserve it, or if there was a construction, renovation, reconfiguration of buildings, open space, parking, or a transportation project that required them to be moved. And I think they're the two requirements of the statute in order for us to take action.
Any further discussion on Resolution 2? And I will say, in relative to the issue of being overly general on this, we did add to the language, I think the third or second sentence, even if relocation were necessary to preserve these monuments, we were not certain we could do so under the constraint of the so-called comparable area of honor or prominence. It's hard at some level to envision an area of prominence that would equate to our Capitol Square in our state. So your point is well made. I certainly understand that, and this was a tough one because we were trying to find a way to avoid being so far out there in specificity that you follow what I'm saying. But I do think hopefully we've stated enough to justify our position on 2. Is there a motion to adopt Resolution 2?
I'll make the motion that we adopt
All right.
Resolution 2.
Is there a second?
I'll second it.
Okay, any further discussion before we take a vote? All in favor of Resolution 2, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed?
No.
No.
Okay, there are 2 noes. It's approved 3-2 for Resolution 2. Okay, the 3-2 would include me. The Resolution 3, and this would assume as amended relative to the previous discussion on removing the sentence that begins with that in order to present, ending with civil rights and social justice, has been moved to the first sentence of Resolution 3. Is there a motion to adopt Resolution 3?
I make a motion that we adopt Resolution 3.
Is there a second?
I'll second it.
Is there seconded by Commissioner Dixon? Is there any discussion on Resolution 3?
Mr. Chairman, excuse me, it appears that there's a typographical error in now the second sentence of number 3. Should commission be committee?
The committee, yes, the committee. Well, that's an interesting point, because then we'll have to turn around and turn it into commission in the next meeting, because we go into full commission. The presumption is that we're making recommendations for the broader commission to adopt, and I'm not sure. Then we'd have to wordsmith that again and make it commission, right? But I do take note of the technical accuracy of that. Okay, any discussion? Again, the sense of Resolution 3 was, and again, I'm not a lawyer, but from a layman's point of view, Resolution 1 was to frankly condemn the imbalance, that it was not defendable. You can't defend the disproportionate memorialization of the Confederacy as it sits today on Capitol Square. Number 2 is an acknowledgement of the constraints of the statute that would preclude us from moving them at this point. Number 3 is the charge, frankly, to all of our state citizenry and leadership to try to rectify the imbalance and take steps to appropriately honor the heritage of African Americans, civil rights, and so forth, that is clearly absent and has been described a number of times at this meeting today. So that's the gist of Resolution 3. Again, certainly further discussion is open.
I have an observation about number 3, and that is, this isn't just about African Americans, but the issue was also bringing a Native American monument on the state capitol grounds, so that would be more accurate reflection if that was included.
I believe women was also included in the 2010 study. It
Yes.
was a recommendation by the 2010 study of the Commission for Native Americans, African Americans, and women,
Yes.
to have representation on Union Square.
Well, I certainly made that in my statement, that I felt that that was appropriate. Are you suggesting an amendment, Dr. Johnson, relative to that?
We might also include unionist, a recommendation that I had suggested earlier.
Yeah, I mean, that's the...
I mean, we go on and on and on.
Well, I was just going back to where the stall occurred and the recommendation that the moratorium be lifted for those 3 specific groups. And that's what I was referring to. So that could be put here, or you can leave it as it is.
Mr. Chair, point of information, the moratorium was lifted by the commission a number of years ago, and the commission directed the department and state government to begin working on creating new monuments. And the first one that the commission selected to add to the Capitol grounds was the African American monument. That did not mean that they weren't saying, the commission did not want to go on with the others. They were just starting with the African American monument.
And I would like to see a public-private partnership, because private partnerships move much faster than public partnerships. And I think that if we get the private sector into this, helping fund and design and build these monuments, it'll happen much more quickly. And I think that's a very important component of this, is to actually have some private leadership in it.
And I will state today, I will personally pledge $500 of my own money to a statue for African Americans during the Civil War era, if that starts the private sector of the public-private component.
I'm happy to join in with that, too.
Well, I think the
Long
other
resolution.
piece that I have to reiterate here is that there is a charge that is directed towards the Department of Natural and Cultural Resources to oversee this process in a more normalized way than, to be frank, with this commission, because we don't want this to be an ongoing, where we're sitting as judge and jury on every aspect of this kind of process, but also, frankly, to charge the governor and the General Assembly with moving on and getting these issues resolved, and not just being in limbo about it. So that's really the sense of I think the sense of the committee here, and would hope that we can move forward on that.
And by the way, I just retired from teaching at UNC Wilmington, so I'm now on state pension. $500 is a lot of money to me.
Is there any further discussion or any
Just a couple of grammatical
Yes.
suggestions, so that in resolution number 1, we have now inserted into resolution number 3, we would say resolved, that in accord, and then that in order to present a fair and more accurate explanation would now be first,
Yes.
and first would become second, so that we've actually got 4 points in that resolution.
Okay, so that first would be the first sentence, and then that in accord with would be second, right? That second?
The second would be that the 3 Confederate monuments on the state capitol grounds.
Right. Would be
Right.
second, and then where we go into second, that the Department of Natural and Cultural, that becomes third, correct?
Correct.
And then fourthly, where it was third, it's now fourth, that the governor and the General Assembly work together, right?
And last but not least, in the sentence, struggle to overcome the consequences of, please omit the, or article the in front of slavery. Struggle to overcome the consequences of slavery, it should read, and not the slavery.
Okay, yes. All right.
I want to make one other, if I could, just for clarity. Could we separate the resolution to place an African-American monument on Union Square from the contextualization piece. Would it be possible to create a fourth and just move it down separately for clarity? Because it seems to be mingled in there a little bit too much, and just for clarity, I think that might be more clear. Starting with second, just to carve that, everything from there down, and just make it a fourth resolution.
Okay, that is a motion.
Well,
I'll second.
You need to rescind the original motion
Are
for 3 as a whole, and then put forward a new motion for the new number 3.
Okay.
So
Could you,
rescind the first one.
could you state succinctly what your proposal is, Commissioner Reynolds?
Yeah, my proposal is that on Resolution 3 as a whole, that the last, I guess it's 2 sentences or paragraphs, starting with second, that the Department of Natural and Cultural Resources plan, design, and raise. I would like everything starting with second and below just turn into a fourth motion, so that that recommendation for that monument is separate and distinct from the contextualization and signage of the third.
And if we're to do that, then I think Dr. Fonville will have to rescind his motion for the original number 3, and then we can go forward with a 3 and a 4. And I've been asked for you to speak closer to it.
I'm unwilling to do that. I don't think it's necessary.
Okay, the original motion has been rescinded, so we
No,
are,
he said he
No,
didn't want.
I'm
to
unwilling
rescind.
to make that motion.
Now-
I don't think it's
Now you have to
necessary.
go
Okay.
through a regular
Okay.
amendment.
okay. So is the amendment or suggested amendment to Resolution 3, as I understand it, is extracting the sentence or the statement of proceeding with an African-American monument, to treat that as a separate resolution. Is there a second to that? Number one, that's what we need to determine first. Is there a second to Commissioner Reynolds? Okay.
I made that.
Okay,
I
the
second.
second to that. So any further discussion? Is there the vote on that then is all in favor of the amended?
Of amending.
All in favor of the then now we're talking about another resolution. So
Correct.
we're really talking about amending out of Resolution 3.
Well, my problem with Resolution 3 is it presupposes that they're going to stay, and we haven't really finished the whole commission vote yet. So the wording of that is what troubles me. You could alter it to say that there be signage placed beside those 3 specific monuments wherever they might end up, and we could either vote to move them or vote to not as a full commission, and the signage would follow them wherever they go. But there's a presupposition of a conclusion in that which causes me a little bit of trouble.
That's the determination that will be made by the commission at large.
Right, but we're
Simply the
voting ahead of time.
recommendations we're making to the
Right.
commission.
Right.
If you,
Okay, so first things first, you are recommending removal from Resolution 3 of a proposed statue to African Americans.
yes,
We need to clean that out first, right?
yes.
All in favor of that? Vote aye.
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 All opposed?
No,
No. I vote no. So at this point, they stay together in terms of the resolution. So I do hear your point, but, I do think certainly that does not detract from the commitment of the committee to see that this is done post-haste.
Right, I just think that the spirit of 3 is that the signage should be placed beside those monuments wherever they are. If they end up staying, we put them there. If we end up moving them, we put them there too. That's all I'm just want to be clear about.
Okay. All right. Therefore, we've determined the resolution of extracting that from Resolution 3 is voted down. So let's go back to adoption of Resolution 3 as amended, which did include the last sentence of previous Resolution 1. So again, Dr. Fonville, I presume that's a motion to adopt.
correct. I make a motion to adopt resolution.
Seconds on that. Seconded by Commissioner Dixon. All in favor of the amended Resolution 3, vote aye.
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 All opposed?
No.
Okay. The vote then is 4-1 on Resolution 3. Okay? All right. Well, that, I believe, concludes our business in terms of this committee. Again, I want to thank each and every one of you for that. I think it's been proof positive that we have differences of opinion on some of this, but again, it has been done in an incredible spirit of cooperation and civility, and I just want again to commend these members for all the work they've done. It's been an interesting journey and a lot of work. Please have order. This committee is adjourned, and we will then proceed on for the full commission meeting.
If the commissioners will come to the table, please. We're going to stand up for a second. Everyone, we're just waiting on an edited version of the committee's final resolution. As soon as we receive the edited version, as soon as we receive copies of that edited version of the resolution, the commission will start. So we're just waiting on some things to be printed out.
Call to order the meeting of the full North Carolina Historical Commission. I will again want to repeat the admonition that this is not a public hearing but a public meeting, and again, decorum is advised. Outburst will not be tolerated. The other comments we made relative to welcoming, in the interest of time, greetings and thank yous, I defer to reference from the previous committee meeting. But I would ask the full commission members to identify themselves, starting with Ms. Klutz as being present.
Thank you. My name is Margaret Klutz, and I'm from Salisbury, North Carolina.
My name is Mary Lynn Bryan, and I'm from Fayetteville, North Carolina.
My name is Barbara Snowden, and I'm from Currituck, North Carolina.
I believe we have everyone here from the committee. So Ms. Barbie?
Oh, okay. I was looking at
They've
already introduced themselves.
We know who you are. No, I'm Millie Barbie from West Jefferson.
I'm Bill Ivey from Asheboro.
I'm Dave Denard from Greenville, North Carolina.
Well, thank you very much. Again, I
will note that we do have a quorum.
Okay, thank you, sir. Thank you, Dr. Cherry. I also want to, again, as a part of normal procedure, ask, because we do have a number of things on the agenda relative to particularly to sessions, which is a normal course of business for the Historical Commission, but is there any aspect of the remaining part of our agenda that would present a conflict of interest for any of the members of the full commission? The question being asked. And
Chairman, I serve on the board of the Museum of the Albemarle, so on the dia sessions and the sessions, I will not be voting on that particular thing.
Thank you, Commissioner Snowden. Is there any other component of the agenda of what we're being asked to work on today that would present anyone else a conflict of interest? Hearing none, we will proceed on that basis. Obviously, we also need to approve minutes from the prior meetings, and that includes September 22nd, 2017. I ask, it's been submitted to the members, and hopefully you've seen those as well. Is there any motion to accept those or amend those minutes from September 22nd?
I move acceptance.
Thank you, Dr. Denard. Do I hear a second?
A second.
Thank you, Commissioner Snowden. Then all in favor of adopting the minutes?
Aye.
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 And that does include the December 20th, 2017 minutes. I apologize. That was the meeting we had via telephone, teleconference. Could I ask for an adoption of those minutes as well?
I move their adoption.
Thank you, Dr. Bryan.
I second.
Thank you. All in favor of adopting the minutes for December 20th, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. All opposed? They are stand adopted. Obviously, the issue on the table for the full commission is the acceptance or the deliberation and potential acceptance of the recommendations that were presented to you by the most recent committee meeting that we just adjourned. And I believe copies have been distributed. Does every member now of the full commission have copies of the amended resolutions? We had, one of the things that I'm going to take a little bit of liberty with, to be honest with you, because Commissioners Johnson and Reynolds, they are they're into their academic year and have to leave at a certain time. And if it's okay with the remainder of, we could spend 15 minutes effectively describing what we did to honor the charge of the September 22nd. I think you saw evidence of what we had done in the last hour or so, but rather than just cite all of those charges that in terms of what we got, who we listened to, what opinions we received, how we deliberated around that, is there okay to dispense with that listing? Is that okay with you, Dr. Cherry? Okay. All right. Well, let's then, each of you now have copies of the finalized three resolutions that were approved by the study committee of the Confederate memorial issue. And I would like to ask if there are any motions for those adopted, or any, maybe a better way to say that is there any reaction or discussion from the broader commission as a whole, and then leading into motions for adoption of these?
Mr. Chair, one point of clarification. Is it possible for you to read the vote for each of the resolutions?
The vote?
Yes.
As I understand, Resolution 1 was unanimous.
Unanimous, yes.
As I understood, Resolution 2 was 3-2. As I understood, Resolution 3 was 3-2.
No, that was 4-1.
Excuse me, 4-1. I beg your pardon, 4-1.
I'm not sure my mic's on.
4-1, I apologize. All right. Do I hear any motion to adopt? And again, I would like to do this in the same order that we did in the committee, and that is, in fairness, let's treat each resolution separately, not as a slate.
I make a motion that we accept Resolution 1.
I second.
Okay. Again, the summary of that, Resolution 1, is the acknowledgement of the imbalance of the current memorialization of the Confederacy, okay, of Confederate memorial monuments. It has been motioned that acceptance of Resolution 1 by the full commission by Commissioner Snowden. Do I hear a second?
I did.
Okay. Commissioner Bryant, thank you. Any discussion? All in favor of Resolution 1, so state aye.
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 All opposed? It carries unanimously. Resolution 2, which is the technical perspective of the committee, that there are limitations on our ability to move, if even desire to move, the monuments, with some specificity included in it, is in a general sense is what that is. Do I hear any motion to adopt Resolution 2?
I make the motion.
Dr. Fomble is, do I hear a second?
I second.
Commissioner Barbie, thank you. A second is issued by her. Is there any discussion on Resolution 2? I will then call for a vote on Resolution 2. All in favor of Resolution 2, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. All opposed?
No.
So I believe 1, 2, 3. Is it 9-2? Is that my understanding? Maybe I need to show a vote of hands to be very accurate. All in favor of Resolution 2, please raise your hand. Okay, all opposed, please raise your hand. Okay. That is passed for Resolution 2. Resolution 3 is the one that we just had some discussion about whether it's appropriate to split that. It's certainly understandable why it would have more power, if you will, behind it to separate the commitment to proceed with an African-American monument per se, but it certainly isn't, it remains embedded in Resolution 3. But it is effectively the charge to all parties to post haste rectify this imbalance that we're dealing with. That's really the gist of Resolution 3. So having said that, are there any motions to adopt Resolution 3?
I move we adopt it.
I'll second.
Thank you. Commissioners Dixon and Barbie respectively moved and seconded. Any discussion on Resolution 3? Having heard none, I'll call for a vote. All in favor of Resolution 3, please signify by raising your hand. All opposed? The motion the resolution is adopted. Okay. Again, thank you all as full commissioners for your granting us the ability to do this work for you.
All the rest, I certainly, and probably most of the rest of the commission, appreciates all of your hard work. And Mr. Chairman, I guess especially to you, and trying to counterbalance this, but I think what we have done is a very appropriate response.
Well, I think if I do say so myself, it has nothing to do with me, but it has everything to do with particularly these other 4 committee members, and that is, I think you've seen exhibited today, clearly differences of opinion, but there was no acrimony, no sense of anybody talking from talking points or just traditional environment we tend to operate in, and I just hope you accept that that has been the nature of how we've operated from the beginning of this process, and it's been really rewarding to me because I think it does tell us we can still manage things, we can still try to figure out tough solutions and do it in a respectful and civil way. Okay, I believe at this time then we can, we do have another item that is somewhat relevant to monuments, and particularly one monument in particular.
Yes, sir.
Dr. Cherry, relative to the petitions.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. The commission has received 6 largely identical petitions from individuals regarding the Confederate monument located on McCorkle Place at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, better known as Silent Sam. It should be noted that the commission has not received any petition from any governing body associated with the University of North Carolina system.
Not unlike what we had discussion before in the committee, I would like to ask Karen Blum, who is our general counsel, a question of legal advice relative to the appropriateness of these petitions before the commission at this point in time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My apologies for speaking behind your head. As with in the committee, this commission has the privilege of going into closed session to receive advice of counsel, to receive attorney-client privileged information. Alternatively, the commission may waive attorney-client privilege and proceed on the open record to receive advice of counsel, where it otherwise would be privileged. What's the pleasure of the commission?
I know my preference would be to remain completely transparent and open, but I'm open for any other thoughts from the commission to...
I move we waive and allow open advice.
I'll second that.
Okay, the motion, all in favor of remaining in open session and receiving legal advice, so indicate. Anyone opposed? Okay, thank you. It's passed unanimously. Go ahead, Ms. Bloom.
All right. Again, the commission has chosen to receive legal advice in open session and has waived its attorney-client privilege on this legal matter. Mr. Chairman, I believe, and members of the commission, I believe that the petitions for the removal of what is called Silent Sam are still in front of the commission, because although the monument on top, the soldier on top, was removed, the pedestal below, which has inscriptions and a bronze plaque, still remains. So in my opinion, that is before the commission. The question of whether it is properly before the commission is, I believe, the question that Chairman Ruffin has asked. Generally, just to summarize the petitions, and I think there were 7 petitions, although one was submitted by one person but signed by somebody who had already submitted another petition. So it's 6 or 7, depending on the count. These petitions were submitted by the people, and they define themselves as residents, stakeholders in UNC, the UNC system, representatives of civic groups and community organizers, UNC students, faculty, and staff. According to these petitioners, there is no language in Chapter 100 that would prevent the people from petitioning the commission. The relief that these petitioners seek, and I should mention that all of these petitions are substantially the same, they seek to relocate Silent Sam from McCorkle Place to Bentonville or another equivalent location. They would like for the commission to recognize that the petitions are properly before the commission, and they would like to be heard. They would like for the commission to consider and approve the petitions. In my opinion, as counsel for the commission, this is not the opinion of the Attorney General's office, this is my opinion as your counsel. Even if the petitioners secured the relief that they sought, would it fix their injury? Could it possibly fix their injury? In other words, if the commission said, okay, and granted the petition, what would that do? The commission does not move monuments. It considers petitions before it. The petitioners here are not requesting that they be allowed to move the monument, but they are essentially seeking approval for somebody else to move the monuments, and that somebody else presumably would be the University of North Carolina or somebody else in the system. And the university is the agency to which that property is allocated. And in my opinion, these petitions are not properly before the commission.
I think again, I'm not a lawyer, the layman's interpretation of that to me over discussions with Karen Blum have been this, in effect. There's some case study that would say that the agency, as she said, I call them the custodian of the monuments, really are the ones that would need to petition the Historical Commission for us to take action. And the practical side of that, if you think about it, that every one of us in this room could petition the Historical Commission on a daily basis about some marker or some plaque that they didn't particularly like. And the point being is there's been some adjudication of this in the past, and that would give some precedence, if you will, around narrowing that ability for petitions to come, and it needs to largely come from the custodian or the agency charged with maintaining the, is that a sufficient layman's interpretation of it? That it would need to have, and I guess the statement that I didn't hear you say is standing, but that's kind of what I was fishing for. Do they have standing as petitioners before our commission?
Standing is, of course, a legal term, and I was sort of avoiding that to not confuse the issue, but yes, you are correct. The threshold question that any petitioner would need to meet is, does the petitioner have standing before this body? And in my opinion, the answer is no.
Do I hear any discussion further?
I believe that's an appropriate opinion, and it also might be noted that it's at least been reported in the newspapers or some other public forum, I've forgotten where I read it, that the University of North Carolina had already, their leadership had received a legal opinion that they could not remove the monument. And so if we were to consider that question, it should come from the trustees or the board at the University of North Carolina, in my opinion. I am a practicing lawyer. I'm not an expert in this area, but I did estates and estate planning and county attorney and that type of thing, but it still, it seems to me that your opinion is very reasonable.
Dr. Denard.
I have one question related to this. Is it possible for this body to acknowledge receipt of these petitions without taking action? I enjoyed the discussion coming from the subcommittee this morning, talking about the unjust laws and all of that, and the whole historical discussion, you know, that was presented from Bentonville and Reynolds, Johnson, and Dixon, and so forth and so on. And then the third, resolution where we are at least saying to the legislature and others, that we do not have the legal responsibility to address this petition that's been sent to us, but we acknowledge that, this is something that should be considered. And I think for us as historians and students of history, we have a responsibility to at least recognize the connection of these concerns. And what I think we want to encourage in every instance is to adhere to what the late historian John Hope Franklin said. He said that every generation has an obligation to write its own history, is expected to write its own history. And I think as the commissioners, the North Carolina Historical Commissioners, we can at least encourage the general public, to behave in a certain way without saying that we don't hear you unless you go by way of this means, because we see in some cases that some individuals in positions, are not really stepping up to the plate. And if we don't do that, I think the people will take it upon themselves at some point to do what they think needs to be done, with or without our approval. And I'm not saying I approve of breaking laws in an unjust fashion, but when you are dealing with laws that may be conceived as unjust, and a period of history, that may need to undergo some change, I think we need to speak to that and not, stick our heads in the sand. Otherwise, we give encouragement to folk to behave in some maybe illegal ways, because it's the people's history.
They've already acted in a legal way by destroying public property, and that certainly is not the answer.
Mr. Chairman, I will note that staff has already received the petitions on behalf of the commission, and those petitions are in the official files of the commission and will be preserved by the state archives.
I think Dr. Denard's excellent point, though, is that we don't want as a commission to be perceived to be shutting our doors or shutting our ears or eyes to anything that is coming up. It's just that technically we don't want to overreach our capacity to deal with it.
Well, couldn't we just have a motion, maybe Dr. Denard would want to make it, that we acknowledge, or I'll make the motion, that we acknowledge receipt of this and have been advised by counsel that they are not in good standing, and we would that they're not in good standing.
I'd like to make a comment as well, if I may.
Or whatever language she might.
I wanted to follow up on Dr. Denard's comment, and I'd included this in my statement, and I want to make sure that it does not get lost regarding what happened at University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. The protection of history and the promotion of justice neither includes the unlawful destruction of public property nor the circumvention of the oversight of duly elected and appointed government officials. And I want to say that as a commission, I believe the petitions were read and your voice has been heard. But again, I think that there are proper oversight bodies. For the university system, it would be the Board of Governors. If there was a local object in a city or county, the county commissioners or the city council, the people that are closest to the objects in the history would be the proper persons to decide those matters. And people, I would prefer that they would petition whatever local or regional governing body that is allocated with the oversight of the object. In the case of the Union Square, the administration committee has proper jurisdiction over that, and we are the keepers of the Capitol. I think Dr. Cherry is the keeper of the Capitol, so it's very proper for a request of that nature to come before the Historical Commission. So I just want to reiterate that there are proper oversight bodies, and that we should try to use those when we want to have our voices heard. Thank you.
Dr. Johnson.
I think adding to that, though, is, and I'm echoing Dr. Denard, that those bodies that need to consider these petitions from their constituents need to take that seriously and really hear what the concerns are from their constituencies, and so take action as appropriate and not necessarily have to fall on the on us as a body, as the Historical Commission, to do that work for them.
Well, that's an excellent point, and a point of the privilege of the chair here to just express an editorial opinion. Our goal as a Historical Commission is to get back to what we're charged with doing. We are, frankly, have been thrown at us a political decision, and we're not a classic political body in that sense. So that's what we do, and I echo Dr. Johnson's comments that other forms need to deal with these issues as they come through, because I think that's at some level not really our primary charge. A lot of our primary charge is the items we've still got to go through on the agenda, which is not going to show up in the News and Observer. So my point there is I'm open for anybody that would suggest, in the interest of time, a appropriate response to the petitions.
So, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ivey has a motion before us to acknowledge receipt and to state that the petitioners lack standing.
Okay. Any second to that? Any second to Mr. Ivey's motion that the petitions have been received but are not appropriate for us to or lack standing at this point?
I'll second that motion.
Okay. Commissioner Fonville has seconded. All in favor? Any further discussion? All in favor of that motion, signify by raising your hand. All opposed? It's, I believe, unanimous. So, okay.
One point of clarification about the discussion. UNC is state property, and so if those petitions are properly before whoever is the custodian of that land, then that entity can certainly bring a petition
Yes.
to the
Yes.
to the history.
Fully understand.
Okay.
But we have not received such a petition.
But I think our
Exactly.
point was, we don't need to jump ahead. We don't need to jump ahead of that on the presumption we're just let's go to the Historical Commission on every event like that. Okay. All right. I believe we just... Yeah, I believe at this point that does conclude all of our discussion relative to monuments or any related issues to monuments or petitions thereof. Again, the remaining part of our meeting will be dealt with normal agenda items like sessions and so forth. So for those of you that may want to leave, we certainly do understand at this point.
But they're welcome to stay.
And they're certainly welcome to stay. This is kind of our bread and butter of what we do.
Look at
Okay.
So we will just pause the meeting. We won't adjourn it. We will just pause the meeting to allow people to leave, and then we will start up as soon as the crowd has left.
Okay, so we're here now.
We do not have to do that. We only have to do that if, but we have to vote to make it off.
protest.
What you need to say is
Where everybody
Lecture.
I couldn't get out of a chair.
I lecture some of it.
that was based upon the fact if the monument moves, since the monument
And then I
moves, is there a motion to remove it?
give a program once in a while, out at a museum or something. Got an antique shop and all Piedmont.
Okay, again, in the interest of time, because we've got two commissioners that need to go and do their academic duties in the early stages of their school year responsibilities, we want to proceed on. We do have a NC statute 121.12. I guess it's relative to, it would have affected had we chosen to move.
Right.
Dr. Cherry, if you might
Yes, sir.
give us a little more accurate
The
elaboration
state
of
capital
that.
is in a National Historic District. If the body had voted to move one of the monuments, that could have had an adverse effect on a National Register district, which means that we would have had a 121.12A, which we hear a lot, a state action with effect upon a National Historic District, where the body would have to hear that. The monuments were not moved. We do not have any 121.12A action to take up before us, but it was on the announced agenda, so we have to note that we are removing it formally from our agenda.
Okay. Any motion to that effect to formally remove that from our agenda?
So moved.
Okay, so moved. Second? Second. All in favor of removing that item from the agenda, so state aye. All in favor? That's, okay, we're now at the point of discussing, of course, the accessions and deaccessions of our collection. And at this point, I will turn it over to the great expert, Dr. Cherry, on that.
All right. The Agency Collections Committee, chaired by myself and with representation from the Division of State Historic Sites and the Division of State History Museums, has met, and we reviewed the division's curatorial and leadership recommendations concerning accessions and deaccessions of artifacts coming from each of our institutions. Before the commission meeting, you were all sent the accessions and deaccessions proposal, and those are proposals until you vote upon them, for our permanent collections. So we will walk through very quickly by institution and by accession and deaccession, and I will be asking if you have any questions, and then we will take a vote on the action, noting that the vote will be either accessioning the items or deaccessioning the items, but also giving the Office of Archives and History the ability to take the specific kind of accessioning or deaccessioning. In other words, it might be deaccession to a teaching collection, or it might be sold at auction, or it might be destroyed appropriately. Those are noted individually. I will not go through each of those individual actions, but I will just do them by institution. We'll begin with the North Carolina Museum of History and the North Carolina Museum of History affiliates, the North Carolina Museum of History's accessions, which are page 2 through 41. Are there any discussions about any of these additions to the permanent collections of the North Carolina Museum of History here in Raleigh?
I move their approval.
A second.
All right. You want to see the all, or you want me to do this part? All those in favor of accessioning these items into the Museum of History signify by saying aye.
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 Any opposed? All right.
Just one question.
Yes, sir.
I assume when you are accessioning items, you are going to have room for storage.
We
And I
are
know
very
that's a
tight
constant
with
question,
storage.
probably.
It is one of the great challenges before us, but I can promise you we have space for these, and we're trying to find more storage. But you're right, that is one of the challenges for us right now.
And then the other question, shouldn't you always ask, and I'm sure you do, does this fit our mission?
That is the first and primary thing that we do when we accession items. What you see before you in this packet is a very tiny percentage of what is offered to the Museum of History.
You're
Or
asked
to
to
our,
do this much and you.
That's right, and it is a very difficult thing to do. We match the items to our mission first, and then after the mission, there are things like condition, the compelling stories, the provenance, those sorts of things.
But you also, you can't tie anything or promise anything. This will be on display or.
We can't make those promises. We do not want to tie the hands of the people who come after us because the way we tell history changes over time.
Sure.
Well, as an inside comment, maybe it could be in his cupboard.
That's right.
To add storage.
Yes. All right, so now we move to the...
And Mr. Chairman, just to make sure that the commission has legally completed these actions,
Right.
that the chair should ask for the motion and.
Okay, all right. Well,
All right.
you put me back in. Thank you, Phil. I will ask for a vote. I believe, has it been?
We need to vote again then on Museum of History.
Okay.
accession.
Museum of History accessions. Do I hear a motion?
So moved.
So moved, seconded, and I will ask for a vote. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, nay. It's adopted unanimously.
So now I present the North Carolina Museum of the Albemarle in Elizabeth City, noting that we have an abstention before us, a recusal before us, and those items are located on pages 42 through 51. Are there any questions about the items 42 through 51?
I move approval.
Dr. Denard has moved approval of those items.
I second.
They are seconded. Who seconded? I'm sorry. Oh, Dr. Johnson, right here. Okay, and so we move then. Any further discussion on these items? I ask for a vote then. All in favor, say aye.
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 All opposed, say no. Accepted unanimously.
And now the North Carolina Maritime Museum system of the three institutions, their accessions are located on pages 52 through 68. Are there any questions about any of those artifacts to be added to the permanent collections of these institutions?
I move approval.
Second.
Commissioner Klutz seconds, Commissioner Barbies. So all in favor of the accessions of the North Carolina Maritime Museum signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All opposed? It is approved.
Now we move to deaccessions. These are deaccessions from the North Carolina Museum of History, pages 69 through 70. I will note that deaccessions are primarily duplication of items or items that are in too poor condition that we would ever put them on exhibit.
Dr. Cherry, would you just explain again, are these presentations to the department, and they are,
These are, for something to be deaccession, they had to have been accessed. So at some point, these were considered important enough to add to the permanent collection of the museum. Since that time, we maybe acquired another item. Apparently, we got offered a lot of North Carolina pottery, and we have a great North Carolina pottery collection, but there are just so many of a certain kind of item you can have by the certain maker from the same time period with the same. And so that's the situation with some of these very fine, very nice pieces of North Carolina pottery, but we already have things like them. In other instances, we maybe accepted a collection of items at one time in the past, and some of those items were not as compelling as other items in the collection, but we accepted the whole box. And in other situations, items have basically, even though we stored them very well, we took care of them to the best of our abilities, it is just the nature of things organic that they fall apart, and these items have over time gotten to a state that we would not ever put them on exhibit. And if we're not ever going to put them on exhibit, why would we want to keep them on the shelves and take up space for something that we would put on exhibit?
Dr. Cherry, isn't it true that the collection is sanctisancts? It's a separate group of property. It's not property like desk and.
Oh, no.
And that you can deal with that as you want to, but this, it takes board approval because when you accession it, it's part of the collection. When it's a deaccession, then it can be approved with the approval of this board, then it can be sold.
Right, or it could be transferred to another museum, or it can be auctioned off, it can be sold to another museum, it can be placed in a teaching collection where it can be loved to death by our visitors and have another role as an educational item. So there are a number of ways, and most of these tell you what's going to happen upon deaccessioning. So those are deaccessioning actions. And you're right, by the time these materials come to the Historical Commission, they've been looked over by individual curators, by institutional committees, and by the Office of Archives and History Committee. So they've already gone through 3 levels of scrutiny before they come to you before the final say. Okay? So we do have the deaccessioning of the North Carolina Museum of History items before us, pages 69 through 70. Any questions about any individual item?
I move approval.
A second.
The approval of the deaccessions of the North Carolina Museum of History have been recommended and seconded. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed?
The Museum of the Albemarle items for deaccessioning are listed on page 71. Are there any questions about those items to be deaccessioned?
I move their approval.
Dr. Bryan has moved. Do I hear a second?
Second.
Second has been made, so all votes on the deaccession of the Museum of the Albemarle, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. All opposed? It is approved.
All right, so now we move to the Mountain Gateway Museum. Deaccessions are found on page 72 through 75. Are there any questions about any individual item?
I move approval.
I second.
Commissioner Barbie and Commissioner Johnson have motioned and seconded the deaccessioning of the Mountain Gateway Museum. All in favor, say aye.
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 All opposed, no. That's approved.
Then we treat the North Carolina Maritime Museum system as a system, the 3 museums. So from those 3 museums, the deaccessions are found on page 76 through 86. Are there any questions about any individual item?
What pages are these?
76 through 86.
Okay. Yeah, okay.
I make a motion that we accept these deaccessions.
Commissioner Snowden has made the motion. Do I hear a second?
Second.
Commissioner Klutz has motioned a second. So all in favor of the deaccessioning of the North Carolina Maritime Museum, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed? It is approved.
All right. We now move to accessioning items into the collection of the Division of State Historic Sites. Those individual sites are noted inside of the report to you. I will not be going by individual site, however. We will vote on accessions for all of the Division of Historic Sites together. Those accessions are found on pages 87 through 89. Are there any questions about any individual item?
Move they be approved.
Ivy has made a motion that they be approved. Do I hear a second? Dr. Denard has seconded. All in favor of the deaccessioning of the North Carolina State Historic Sites in group as listed as one group, vote aye. Aye. All opposed, no. It is approved.
So then finally, these are the deaccessions from all of the historic sites in the Division of State Historic Sites. They're located on pages 90 through 92. Are there any individual items that that you need more information about?
I move approval.
Commissioner Barbie has moved acceptance of the deaccessions of the North Carolina State Historic Sites. Do I hear a second?
Second.
Dr. Johnson, thank you. You have a second. All in favor of deaccessions to the North Carolina State Historic Sites, vote aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, it is approved unanimously.
All right, and so because the state archives is treated differently by law when it comes to accessions and deaccessions, I will ask our state archivist to come forward and present items to be deaccessioned from the state archives collection. I will note that the commission does not have say over accessioning into the state archives. That is done by state law. But when it comes to deaccessioning, the Historical Commission does have say over deaccessioning items in the state archives.
Thank you, Dr. Cherry. Members of the commission, I put in your packets several different groups of public records, which I think we should talk about first before we do the deaccessions from the Outer Banks History Center. The public records were provided in by what group they were. I'm happy to consider those individually or as a group, as per your wishes.
Mr. Chair, I move that we deal with these as a group.
You could maybe just describe them as a...
Okay, I'll summarize a little bit about these records. These are records that were, as Kevin mentioned with the History Museum, once something is accessioned, it has to be deaccessioned only through your approval. So we have in the group of public records series that have been previously reviewed over time and deemed to be not archival. So the agencies that created these records have already destroyed more current versions of these records, but because these were accessioned into our collection, the older ones, they need to be deaccessioned. We recommended destruction for all of them with the exception of the last series. That was a group of records created by the Bar Association. They have elected to have those deaccessioned and returned to them, which is an allowable form of deaccessioning. And I'm happy to answer any questions about any of them.
I want to be accurate on this. This category of deaccessions would be entitled what? What would this be as opposed to what we just voted on?
We just voted on accessions and deaccessions of the History Museum and the historic sites. Those are covered under one state law. The archives is done under another state law, so that's why it has to be treated different.
Okay.
You could accurately describe them as deaccessions that are public records.
Okay.
That's right.
I move approval.
Thank you, Dr. Bryan. There's a motion for approving the deaccessions from the state archives.
Correct.
Is that a fair way to describe that? Do I hear a second?
I'll second that motion.
Dr. Feinberg is a second. All in favor of approving the deaccessions from the state archives, vote aye.
Aye.
All opposed? Hear none, so that is approved as well.
Okay. The last group that I separated out, and I think you might want to discuss separately, are some deaccessions from our satellite collection, the Outer Banks History Center, which is located in Manio. They are a special collections operation, and what I mean by that is they're not really supposed to be collecting public records. They do private papers and materials and photographs and things like that. So the list that I provided in a table format are secondary sources. So none of these are manuscript. They're not original materials. They're all print. None of them fall into the collecting parameters of the Outer Banks History Center. You'll see most of them aren't even from the region where they collect. They're often from other areas. And where possible, we have gone through WorldCat and identified where these things sit in other locations. None of these things belong to an individual collection. We believe they were collected over the years when they were discarded from the State Library, NC State, UNC. So someone was just picking them up extras because a lot of them bear marks on the inside that they were coming from another collection. So what we are asking with this group, and some of them are in very poor condition, that we have the authority to, if they are in good condition, find a good home if there is one. If no one was interested in them, then dispose of them. But if they are in really poor condition, that we just dispose of them. Some of them are very, very poor condition and not usable for a library collection. And I'm happy to answer any questions about any of them. It's an interesting group of things that were collected over the years there.
So this is just a hodgepodge of records that were not necessarily generated by that particular site.
Correct. It's just secondary publications. They've picked up anything from statutes from a city to college publications, bulletins from a religious organization. So our thought was if they were in good condition, we would approach that original creator and say, do you want this or do you need it? In a lot of cases, they already have it at their library.
And in a lot of cases, East Carolina University, UNC Chapel Hill, and other places already have these materials in almost all of the cases.
So is it fair to describe this as various documents and publications coming from the satellite
from the
network
Outer Banks
of
History Center?
Outer Banks History Center. Do I hear any motion on deaccessioning of those items?
I make a motion that we deassess them.
Okay. Barmy. A motion has been made and seconded appropriately. All in favor of the deaccession of the materials from the satellite office, is it
Outer Banks
History Center.
Outer Banks History Center, say aye. All opposed, no. It is approved unanimously. Thank you.
All right.
Thank you very much for your work.
Yeah.
We do appreciate that. I know it's got a tedium associated with it, so we do appreciate that very, very much.
We have a request to approve a memorial.
Yes. We do have, Dr. Cherry, we do have a request to approve a memorial, and
I'd like to ask our Director of the Division of State Historic Sites and Properties to come and make the presentation to the Commission for approval of a memorial at one of our sites.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
It is my honor to now serve as your Division Director for the Division of State Historic Sites. You, I believe, have received a digital copy of a request for a marker, a granite marker. This came to us from the Daughters of the Union, specifically the National Society of the Daughters of the Union Pennypacker chapter. And what they have proposed is to erect a small granite marker that would read, "For all who had sacrificed 1861 to 1865 in SDU Pennypacker chapter." This would also be accompanied by a tree in the magnolia family. The blooms would be a pale pink. And the dimensions are 20.5 by 10.5, 3.5 high. We did get an environmental review from our State Preservation Office, and you should have in hand a letter from our own Ramona Bartos that says that she made comment in accord with General Statute 121.12a and Executive Order 16, and that based on the previous ground disturbance associated with construction of the visitor center, it is our opinion that no intact significant archaeological resources will be adversely impacted. So, Chair.
Yes, thank you very, very much. So I asked.
You have a report.
Yes. We do have a report, and again, I will say this kind of as an aside, but I think this is quite in the spirit of what we talked about so much this morning. Right. And I commend you, I commend the efforts that were behind this, and I'd like to see a heck of a lot more of this. Okay?
Thank you, Chair.
As a matter of interest, the Society's namesake is Galusha Pennypacker from Pennsylvania, who was a brigade commander at Fort Fisher, where he was severely wounded, and then helped capture Wilmington and fought at Bentonville, and he is the second youngest American to be promoted to general in United States history. Wow. He was only 22 years old and promoted to generalship.
Well, thank you, Commissioner Vaughn, but I'll be sure to let our site managers know that 3 of our sites are now potentially bonded by this decision.
I've got photos if they need.
Thank you.
Pennypacker is a prominent name in Pennsylvania.
I also would like to commend the State Historic Sites for bringing this to our attention, for doing the due diligence to give us the information. It serves as another way of having a full and inclusive interpretation of the Civil War, so I appreciate that.
Thank you, Commissioner Johnson.
Absolutely. Do I hear any further discussion? Certainly entertaining a motion to accept the tree and marker from the Daughters of the Union organization.
So move.
Mr. Ivy has moved.
Second.
Second, Dr. Johnson. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed? It's unanimously approved. Again, thank you very much for your work.
Thank you. And Dr. Terry, should I come up at another time for the policy?
I think if you just stay right there.
Okay. So you all.
Mr. Chairman, we have a request to make a slight change to the Division of State Historic Sites collection management policy. And so our director is there. We'll just let her make that presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Terry. So we have before you, as you all know, you are the governing committee commission over our collections management policy. I have our head of collections here, Martha Battle Jackson, who has spent quite a bit of time looking over our policy, and there are a number of changes that we are bringing before you, and I believe that you did receive it in advance. We need to, of course, change the revision date on page 1. We also need to delete the last sentence of the first paragraph on page 1, which states that the North Carolina Transportation Museum is no longer under this supervision. As you all will note, per direction of our Cabinet Secretary, Susie Hamilton, the Transportation Museum and Roanoke Island Festival Park have now been returned back to the oversight of this division. So on page 2, we are also recommending a reordering of the list of collections to indicate the importance of the order of creation. So significance order rather than chronological order. And then the last change that we're recommending also recognizes that both the North Carolina Transportation Museum and Roanoke Island Festival Park have been returned to this division.
These do not seem significant or major.
They are not
so
substantive.
In that sense, I call for motions to basically change the policies of the North Carolina Division of State Historic Sites and Properties Collection Management Policy.
I make a motion that we accept these revisions.
Thank you, Commissioner Snowden. Any second? Commissioner Klutz, thank you. I did notice, by the way, before we voted on that there was a signature line for I guess, the chair of the commission, once that's adopted, right? So remind me to sign.
Thank you.
I will ask for a vote on that all in favor of these changes to policy, say aye. Aye. All opposed? It is adopted unanimously.
Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Cherry, I believe at this point we're to giving your report to the commission.
This will be very brief. Mr. Chairman, members of the commission, the North Carolina Department of Natural and Cultural Resources Office of Archives and History is one of the most comprehensive state-based public history institutions in the country. And not only that, I believe we do some of the best work of any public history agency in the country. And I'm very proud of the work that the folks that my colleagues have been able to accomplish over the last year. The individual division reports have been provided to you in advance of the meeting, and I will not go over those reports again, but you have them. I will just note a couple of items. Visitation numbers by institutions were distributed also before the meeting, but what you can't tell from those numbers is the fact that 2017-2018 was the most visited year ever in 115 years of our institution. And I'm very proud of that. We had 2,995,427 visits to our sites, our museums, and archives. So well done, colleagues.
Can't we just say 3 million?
No, that's not the way he operates.
Now, I will tell you, that does not, visitation is one measure, but that does not capture everything that we do. The State Historic Preservation Office, the Office of State Archaeology, the State Archives, most of the work of the State Archives reference work is now done online. So when you look at that visitation number and it's going through the roof, that's amazing, but it does not capture all of the technical advice given, all of the environmental review done, the publications and the work on publications that takes place. Those are just the feet on the ground, but that's still a pretty good measure of the success of our department over the last year. Specifically, we broke the year before's record, which was also a record, by 4% increase in visitation. The North Carolina Transportation Museum saw its visitation rise 22% over the previous year. Duke Homestead saw an 18% increase in visitation over the previous year. Brunswick Town State Historic Site saw a 15% increase over the previous year, and the Museum of History in Raleigh, a 12% increase. And when you have visitation as high as the Museum of History already has, and then you do 12% of that, 12% of a large number is a large number. So it's just been amazing. I will note that our budget for all archives and history institutions for 2017-2018 is appropriated budget is $27,548,547. Last year's receipts that we needed to also run our department was $9,134,564. That means 1/3 of the public history activities from this department are supported in some way by private funds. Currently, we are completing the World War I Centennial Commemoration. The state of North Carolina, we were going to toll bells across the state. The National Commission heard that, and so now it is a national activity. So November the 11th at 11 a.m., the centennial of the end of World War I, the Great War, bells will toll across the country. I will note that in addition to this commemoration, we had one of the finest, if not the finest, exhibitions that the Museum of History has ever mounted. If you have not gone to see the World War I exhibit, you should go see it. There is not anything else in the country that can compete with that exhibit about World War I right now. It is amazing. The Blackbeard 300th will be concluding soon, where the final activities are all around East Carolina University's homecoming and around the annual meeting of the North Carolina Literary and Historical Association and activities at the Queen Anne's Revenge Conservation Lab there in Greenville. We have had our scholarly components for the Blackbeard 300th, and we've also had activities on the North Carolina ferry system, and we've been in community parades. We covered it with pirates this year. The 50th anniversary of the moon landing will largely be an exhibit at the Museum of History, as well as a traveling exhibit, and we've been very active in that. A lot of retirees from NASA live in the mountains of North Carolina, if you didn't know that. And we are planning for 2019 the Year of Music. And so in our historic sites and our museums, we'll be doing more music programming than we generally do. We're also planning the centennial of women getting the right to vote in the U.S., and that will be largely based around an exhibit at the Museum of History, a traveling exhibit mounted by the Museum of History, and the centerpiece is going to be an oral history project led by the state archives with women leaders from across the state. And we are now doing the very beginning planning of the USA 250th. Our capital projects right now, currently, we are involved in the restoration of the shoreline, the ongoing restoration of the shoreline at Brunswick-Town State Historic Site, the reconstruction of the fort at Fort Dobbs, and if you have not been there, you should go while they're still building the fort because it is something to see. We're in the planning stages of the new visitor center at Fort Fisher, and we're doing the site preparation work now for the North Carolina Civil War and Reconstruction History Center in Fayetteville. And also we're planning for the major expansion of the Museum of History that we hope will happen soon. At the next meeting of the commission, I hope that we'll be able to show you Anchor, which is a North Carolina history online resource, which is aimed at 8th grade students who are studying North Carolina history. So I hope we'll be able to show you that. And finally, I would like to welcome Michelle Lanier as the director of the Division of State Historic Sites and Properties. Michelle is returning to historic sites, where she was curator of multicultural initiatives before becoming the founding director of the African American Heritage Commission. She's a graduate of Spelman and UNC Chapel Hill. She's a folklorist by training with a research interest in Africa, the African diaspora. And she's taught at Duke University's Center for Documentary Studies, and she's participated in a number of very powerful oral history projects around the state. So it's good to have Michelle back with us at Historic Sites.
Welcome.
Mr. Chairman, that is the report of the Office of Archives and History, and we do have a special presentation from our publications unit. We will end our meeting, if you desire, with this special presentation.
One quick comment. I just, first of all, tremendous pride in what you just said and all the great success and momentum we're having with the public in terms of visitations of our museums and so forth. But again, I just want to thank you and the whole staff. At some level, we had to do some of the heavy lifting on a lot of the things we've talked about today, but it couldn't have even remotely been possible without the data gathering and the data sharing from your staff and you in particular. I cannot tell anybody enough how dependable, consistent, conscientious your office and your staff have been to support us through this arguably rather tough process that we've had to go through, right?
Well, a lot of those people who did the gathering of the information are sitting right here.
Well, thank you.
Ramona and
thank
Parker
you very, very much.
and Tara.
Okay, I'm in charge of the presentation. And that I stand between you and lunch. I want to be quick about it, but I want to demonstrate the enthusiasm I have for this project we've just completed. Yesterday's mail brought the first advanced copy of this book, which we've labored mightily to produce. It's called This Day in North Carolina History, and it's a day-by-day account, heavily illustrated. There are in this book, pass it around, don't get stuck on it, I want everybody to see it. It's the work of Ansley Wegner and Sheila Carroll, if they would stand. Ansley's a longtime veteran of our office, and she's written a couple of other books, but this one really beats all. It is the extension, Ansley's idea, to extend our 4-year blog, which maybe many of you saw, daily entries as to what happened on July 16th or whatever day. It's an extension to that to book form that will preserve it for the long haul. There are in this book not 366 stories, but there are 1,172. All days have multiple entries. They are the work of staff members. We had volunteers amongst our colleagues, 20 or so, who wrote those. And Ansley worked particularly hard to find the illustrations for it. And finding them, but even more importantly, getting the rights to them is a key part of doing a book like this. Sheila, who's been on our staff a year and a half, she brought to us a set of design skills. She is an extraordinary graphics editor, and she came up with the design for the book. So that's our good news about that. I do want to acknowledge the help of Jeff Miles of our marketing office, no longer with us. He's in law school at Carolina, but he helped initiate this blog and was central to the choosing of the topics, and he wrote many of the entries. The entries vary widely. One of Kevin's favorites, con man Gaston Means, is in there. Many unusual events. The blood shower.
That picture to be in there.
The blood shower in Chatham County in 1884 is described. The night Elvis upstaged Fair and Young at Memorial Auditorium. He was on a bill with mostly country acts, and Elvis was the first. And then after Elvis appeared, many left, and Farron didn't much care for that. So the next project the next publication we expect delivery next week of our special Blackbeard issue of the Historical Review. This cover is based on a painting by a Massachusetts artist named Paul Garnett. It's a beautiful image of the Queen Anne's Revenge. And the issue, every page of the issue, for the first time, is dedicated to a single topic and no book reviews to make room for a number of extraordinary articles. We devoted the whole 128 pages of the review to the QAR. And it includes an extended description of what you probably heard about, which was the discovery of the packing of a cannon with pages from a book. Pages ripped out, proof that pirates did read, that the pages ripped out of a book and stuffed into a cannon have been examined by the archaeologists, and we know what book it was they had. So that's all in that review. And looking ahead, we have plans for other books. Most immediate in our sights is one that's an architecture book called Grand Illusions, about historic decorative painting in North Carolina houses. We have a book for children about the longleaf pine, and a major study on shipbuilding next year. So I hope you all will consider buying this book. We don't have the wherewithal to give you all the copies, but it will be available through all the outlets such as Amazon and direct from UNC Press, which is our marketing partner, and even from Costco. So it's widely available. It's $35, but a bit less online.
When, Mike?
Oh, it'll be delivered next week.
Next week.
We printed 2,000 copies. They were printed in Minnesota. This one was overnighted to us, but we expect the others to be in our warehouse into this week probably. Okay.
It's
me.
perfectly
Great presentation,
designed
Mike.
and done for Christmas gifts. Let me just note that.
Appropriate timing. Thank you, Mike, very much. That's great. Okay. Are we done?
Mr. Chair, just before we leave, I know I'm standing between lunch and whatever, but I don't think we should leave without me saying how grateful I am to this subcommittee for doing all of the work that went into this. This is the document commissioners received, and that's a lot of work. But then the other piece that was even more impressive, or equally as impressive, was these personal texts presented to us here by each of these members of the special committee. And I would like to know if it's possible for those reports to be entered into our records somewhere. And I know that most of you all spoke from prepared text, that would help to contextualize this work for all who would like to see, the due diligence that went into this report, even though we could not make a recommendation to relocate those monuments. I mean, we did make a statement, and that third resolution spoke truth to power. Okay? So if it would be possible, starting with Chris and Sam and on down to Valerie and Noah, and then Mr. Chair, for these comments to be entered into our record. I don't know how extensive the committee, the secretary was in taking notes,
Dr. Denard, we actually have a court reporter transcribing the entire meeting today, so it will be part of the record.
And I believe somebody on staff had requested copies of our statements. The press had requested that as well. So that's, at least I've given, I think most of us have given our statements to the press as well already. So yes, I certainly have no objection to that. Thank you again for your comments. Okay, well, having had a full day, and I know, again, I hope Dr. Johnson and Mr. Reynolds, you're still on time to get back to your student activities. I, again, appreciate the work everyone has done, the spirit in which it's been done, and I believe we can call this meeting. I need a motion.
I just wanted to make one comment before that. All of you who worked with Rodney Barfield and know him and all the years he worked for the state and the Maritime History Council and everything else, went to visit. He has bladder cancer and is undergoing a number of chemotherapy treatments. And I had a Blue Ridge Parkway meeting up in Virginia, so I met he and his wife, Yale, at Stanton, and had lunch, and he was so anxious to hear about everybody and what's going on. And so far, he looked good like the old Rodney, but he's having a tough time. So keep him in your thoughts and prayers.
Thank you, Commissioner Barber. Thank you very much for saying that. Do I hear a motion for adjournment?
So moved.
I don't know who said that. It sounded like a collective sigh of relief. Well, all in favor of adjournment, say aye. Aye. All opposed, no. This meeting is adjourned. Thank you.
We don't get any lunch.
Lunch on your home.
Only if we travel away.